Hi, today I want to talk to you about exposure. Exposure is really, like I say on this slide, bringing it all together. The total amount exposure that you give to a picture or to your film depends on your shutter speed and aperture put together. But before we talk about exposure, there's one more thing that we really have to explore before we go any further, and that is your ISO. If you took digital imaging, you know that on a digital camera, your ISO is always adjustable, and you can change your ISO for various reasons. Your ISO refers to the sensitivity of your film or camera sensor if you're using digital photography. Okay. In our case, we're using film for everything we do, and we only have one ISO to choose from right now. We use the same ISO for all our film, but it's still really important to understand how ISO works so that you can make really informed decisions in the future. And even if you move on to digital photography, your ISO does really matter. So there are really many types of ISO, but they fall into two categories. You have high ISO, which is a really high number like 1600, 3200, something like that. Then you have low ISO, which is like 100. Your high ISO is considered fast film, which means you can have a really fast shutter speed with it because it is so sensitive. That means your film is so sensitive that you just need a tiny bit of light to make a picture. The ISO really depends on the film. It has nothing to do with the camera and not even that much to do with the lighting situation. It's really about the type of film you've put into your camera. In digital photography, you can change your ISO, and instead of film, you have to think of it as your camera sensor. So if you have fast film, a high ISO, it hardly needs any light to take a picture, to record an image onto your film. So why wouldn't everybody use this? That way you can take pictures in dark rooms without a tripod, you can do all sorts of things. You can freeze motion of a basketball game, which is indoors with little light. The reason we don't always use high ISO is because you sacrifice image quality for those other things that you get. Sometimes you might choose to use high ISO though for a number of reasons. One is low light photography indoors. I am a professional photographer and I've been hired by theater productions to take pictures. Theater stages have pretty good lighting for the most part, but there's a lot of movement sometimes with not very much light. And so in order to get a fast enough shutter speed to capture the motion and to freeze it, I need a really sensitive film. So a film with a high ISO. Sports photography also uses this. If you're taking photos of a basketball game or anything that has fast motion, you want a really fast shutter speed. And in order to get a really fast shutter speed and also enough light to record an image onto your film, you need a high ISO. Here's an example of a concert. It's the lighting, it doesn't have tons of bright lights. If it was outdoors on a sunny day, you could probably get by with a different ISO, but you need a really high ISO for this kind of lighting situation. Anytime you hardly have any light to deal with, like starlight is not bright, and so a high ISO would be really valuable there. This is a photo that was taken indoors, but stopped motion. So a high ISO would be really valuable for this one. If you took this photo with the film we use, which is kind of a mid-range ISO, you would not be able to stop motion like this unless you used a flash. I talked a little bit about stage and theater photography, so here's another example of that. I want us to really look closely at these two images that you see here. The one that's on your right has a higher quality image. The one on your left, I'm sorry, your left has a really high quality. The one on your right actually has a lot of digital noise to it. You'll notice that it actually has lots of what we call it digital noise, but if you were doing it with film, you'd still see that as well. It would be graininess. So the same thing happens with digital photography and with film photography. The higher ISO you use, the less quality you have in your images. It's hard to blow them up because you start to see all of this graininess and this digital noise in your images. Here's another example. If you look closely, you can see the 100 ISO has this really sharp edges, fine details, but all those details are lost in the 3200 ISO when they start to be kind of overwhelmed by the digital noise that's there. Here's an even better example. On the left, you can see lots of digital noise again. Same thing happens with film, except we call it graininess. All right, so we talked about high ISOs like 1600 to 3200, but now we need to talk about low ISOs. Those are like the 100, 200 ranges. Low ISOs force you to use a slower shutter speed. They need more light. You know, you can't use the same shutter speed for a 3200 film as you do for a 200 speed film. It would never be enough light to actually record an image onto the film. They're great for outdoor sunny days. But the reason we want to use the lowest ISO we can is because we get a higher quality image. You saw the examples in the last few slides. Here's some examples of when you would use a low ISO. When you have a lot of detail, it's bright, you have plenty of light to record an image onto your film. Maybe you're outdoors and you want a little bit of blur, like this. Or you can handle a slower shutter speed. You want that quality that the low ISO has while also getting, like, you want to use the lowest ISO you can for every situation, basically, because you have the higher quality. When you get into still life photography, always go with a low ISO. You don't, because usually you're using a tripod, you have controlled lighting situations. You really don't need a very fast shutter speed. So where is your ISO? Your ISO on some cameras is called an ASA. I don't know why. So it's usually on our cameras, it is a little tiny window on your on the camera. In this picture, you can see it. This is the knob with all the numbers on it. That's your shutter speed, and the window is on that. So if I pull this up right here, oops. Here is my shutter speed, just like in the picture. That little tiny window that's on the same knob, that is my ISO. Our ISO is always, always, always 400, unless I tell you otherwise. Sometimes our ISO can accidentally change when we're changing our shutter speed over and over again. So if your light meter is ever acting up and not working, the first thing you should always do is check your ISO window to make sure it didn't get shifted or moved. What you set your ISO on for your film. So we always put 400 speed film in here. It's just what we use. Our film comes in a bulk roll like this. It says ISO 400. It's 27 or 100 feet of film. And I put it onto the individual rolls. This film right here is always 400. So you want to make sure that this number stays on 400 and that because what that controls is your light meter. Having what you set your ISO to on here tells your light meter that this is how much exposure I need to take a picture. Now, how do we get to that exposure? All right, how do we get the perfect amount of light into our camera to take the image? We're going to get to that in a second. Here's just a little diagram for ISO, kind of the sliding scale of ISO. You have 100, which is less noise. You use bright light. And then you get down to 3200 where you need less light, but you have a lot of noise on your film. Here's another example. All right, now we're getting to exposure. Let's talk turkey. Like I said before, your ISO determines the exposure needed, okay? So for example, if I have this bowl right here, this bowl, I need a certain amount of water to fill this bowl up. That's my exposure. Now, how I get this water has a couple of variables, okay? They're called shutter speed and aperture. So your shutter speed, how long your shutter is open, plus your aperture, how large your opening is, equals your exposure. In other videos, I compared it to a faucet. So if I was going to fill this bowl with water at the faucet, my shutter speed is how long I leave my faucet on. Okay, I turn it on, do I walk away, do I stay, do I turn it on and off right away? That's my shutter speed. My aperture is how much I turn my water on. Do I just like crack it a little bit so it kind of dribbles down, or do I leave it on full blast for a couple seconds? It's how much water is getting through the opening at once, how large my opening is. When I combine those things, if you want to fill your bowl, you can do it in a couple of different ways. I can put the water on a slow trickle and walk away for 2 minutes and come back and it might be full. I can also get the same amount of water. If I turn it on full blast for a second and turn it off, then I'll have the same amount of water. But I got that same amount of water, that same exposure in 2 different ways by using a different combination of shutter speeds and apertures. So this is an example of, your shutter speed and aperture, really your exposure. You have an image that is too bright, an image that is too dark, and then an image that is just right, if you look at this. The first one is overexposed. It had too much light came in. My bowl was overflowing. This middle is underexposed. Too little, like maybe my bowl only filled up this full, which is not how I wanted it. And then the last one is the perfect exposure. So how do you get this perfect exposure? Well, my guess is that you've probably already figured it out. You're going to use your light meter. Your light meter is controlled by your ISO. Your ISO tells your light meter, this is how much light I need. This is how much water I need to fill this bowl, okay? Your light meter, though, when you're looking through your camera, changes every time you change either your shutter speed, your aperture, or the direction you're pointing your camera. This is an example of one type of light meter. Our light meters are all found inside of our viewfinders. So if you were to take your lens cap off and look through here and push your button just halfway down, you'll see some lights light up in our cameras. So for the Vivitar, when you push it halfway down, what you see is a plus, a red minus, and a green dot in the center. Just like in this example, your idea is to get the rod going straight across. Your goal is to get that green dot in the center to be the only light that is on. So here's an example. If you don't get it in the center, what happens? So if you go towards the negative, so if your red minus is what's lit up, you're going to have an image that is underexposed, sort of like these pictures that are to the left of this diagram. If your plus is what is lit up, then you're going to have it overexposed, and it will look more like the pictures that are on the right of your diagram. Okay, so we combine shutter speed and aperture together to get our exposure. At first, we probably will just be working really hard to get our exposure to be correct. But eventually, you will want to manipulate your shutter speed and aperture to get the effect you want. And I hope that happens sooner rather than later. Here are 3 images, and if you look, they all have the exact same exposure. So this is an example of how 3 different combinations of shutter speed and aperture can give you the right exposure, but 3 really different looks, okay? So if you look over here, I'm gonna use my mouse, this picture, we have an aperture of f22. Do you remember that controlled? Besides the amount of light, it controlled your depth of field. So this picture, if you look in the background, is very sharp. The people, if they weren't moving, they would be very sharp. It has a really deep depth of field. However, because we needed that deep depth of field, we have a teeny tiny opening, so we needed more light. So we had to use a slow shutter speed, which is 1/4 of a second. 1/4 of a second seems fast, but it really isn't in the world of photography. Notice how this couple, they're just having a wonderful time, laughing away. They're having so much fun that they're blurry from all the motion, all the nonsense. That is what happens with a shutter speed of 4 or 1/4 of a second, is that you get this blur to your anytime anything is moving. Then we go to the next step. Same exposure, same amount of light got into the camera, but notice we used an aperture of 8. So our background starts to blur a little bit more. It's not completely blurred, but a little bit more. And because we could open our aperture up just a little bit more, we were able to use a slightly faster shutter speed. So 1/30th of a second, or on our cameras, that would just say 30, a shutter speed of 30. So our couple that's laughing and having a great time, they're a little bit sharper because they've been closer to being frozen. And the background is starting to blur a little bit more, but we can still tell it's a building. Then we go over here to the last one, f2.8. That's a really wide aperture on our cameras. Some of our cameras don't even go that wide that we have here. f2.8 is really wide, but we sacrifice depth of field. So now our background is completely blurry, which there are a lot of times when that's your preference. But you'll notice that because we made this really large, we could use a really fast shutter speed, like 250. So now our shutter speed was able to freeze motion, and the couple that was laughing and having a great time here, they're frozen in the moment because of that fast shutter speed. All 3 examples have the exact same exposure, but all 3 have different combinations and therefore really different effects for the picture in the end. Here's another example. It's a little more simplified, but if you look the same exposure, if you look at the picture on the left, you'll notice that the depth of field is much more shallow. The keys that are closest to us are blurry, and the keys that are behind the hands are blurry, but the hands are stopped and focused. They were moving, but there was a fast enough shutter speed to freeze them. And we could use a fast shutter speed because our aperture opened up wider. Just like if you turn the faucet on to fill up the bowl, if you turn the faucet on all the way, then you can use a fast, like you can turn it on and off right away and still get enough water. Then if you look over to the right, all our keys are in focus. We have a really deep depth of field. Our aperture opening got really small, so we had to use a really long shutter speed. And that long shutter speed actually blurred the motion of the hands to create this blurred motion. Both of these photographs are beautiful for really different reasons. They're the same thing. They give us kind of different emotions and different ideas. And it was simply the only thing they changed was the aperture and shutter speed. All right, so things you need to think about every time you take a picture. And this is where it's so different from photography as we know it now. You all are so used to just snapping photos all the time with your cell phone or with your digital cameras. And things are a lot, you have to really put a lot more thought into things with our cameras. First thing you need to consider, how dark or light is it in here? If you are indoors, you need to use a tripod. There is no shutter speed that I could use in this situation right now that would be fast enough and get enough light to where my photo won't be blurry. If you are inside with one of our cameras, you have to use a tripod. Or if you don't have a tripod, you need to set your camera onto a steady surface to take a picture. All right, here I've got it on my coffee cup to take a picture. Just holding it like this, even though I'm like, I'm as still as a statue, you are not holding still enough. No matter what you think, your pictures will be blurry. I promise you. Here's a good rule of thumb that I always tell everyone. If you use a shutter speed that is less than 60, which is a lot of the shutter speeds, if you use a shutter speed that is less than 60, you should always, always use a tripod. I can't emphasize that enough. It's going to be a very frustrating semester if you try to get by without using a tripod or a steady surface and you're using a shutter speed that is less than 60. You're going to waste a lot of film. The other thing you need to think about is you want to always use the film with the lowest ISO you can for the setting you're in. Why was that? I told you. Do you remember? Because the lower the ISO, the higher the quality. You also need to think about, do you want everything to be sharp and in focus? Do you want everything to be frozen? Is anything moving? If something's moving, do you want to show that motion or do you want to stop the motion? Because that's what kind of shutter speed you're going to want to use. The fourth thing you need to think about is, do you want everything to be sharp and in focus or do you want to have a shallow depth of field? You might not get to do all these things. You might have to decide whether you care more about the motion being stopped or frozen or blurred, or whether you care more about the depth of field. You may not get to choose both. All right, so that's something to consider, because if you set your aperture up for a shallow depth of field, you really are going to have to set your shutter speed to whatever you can get to make your light meter work, and vice versa. All right, so your job is going to be to make sure you can get your light meter into the center the next time I see you, and that you make sure that you understand your camera. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the other thing you need to consider every time you take a picture is that you need to focus. You need to turn your lens to focus your picture. Also, something that my students always forget in this class, because you're used to having, I think, cell phone cameras, I guess, I don't know, but that your camera also turns this way so you can take vertical pictures or horizontal. Just a few things to keep in mind. Because you are going to want to, I know there's a lot to remember, but you're still going to want to take beautiful pictures. All right? If you have any questions, you can email me, let me know, talk to me in class, whatever it takes. Have a good day.